Welcome to Rizzoli Bookstore. Thank you all for being here to celebrate the launch of Jamie Wyeth, Unsettled. I'm Margaret Chase, Associate Publisher of Rizzoli Electa, and I'm extremely pleased to introduce our speakers tonight. Jamie Wyeth hardly needs an introduction, a celebrated contemporary painter and member of the renowned American artistic family, is joined tonight by Amanda Burdan, Senior Curator at the Brandywine Museum of Art. I'm incredibly proud to be publishing Jamie's book, a beautiful and thoughtful collaboration which accompanies a mesmerizing exhibition at the Brandywine Museum. I also want to mention the team at Rizzoli who put the book together. Ellen Cohen, who was our editor, the designer, Barbara Glauber, production manager, Alyn Evans, and Nikki Clendenning, who's our publicist extraordinaire. I hope you'll have a chance to see the show at the Brandywine Museum. It's beautifully curated, and it depicts works painted over a 60-year career in Jamie's home places, Brandywine Valley and Mid-Coast Maine. Works with lush and visceral intensity, and all projecting a strain of mystery and foreboding. I was able to attend the opening a few weeks ago and be entertained by Jamie's masterful storytelling, so I'm really looking forward to his conversation with Amanda tonight. I understand it's quite a coup to get Jamie here, so enjoy. They will be in conversation together for probably around 40 minutes, with time at the end for questions. Afterward, they'll be signing books at the table over there to the right. And you can purchase books at the registers at the front. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jamie.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you everybody at Rizzoli for making this a really painless process, honestly. I know you think looking at your work after years in exhibitions is a little bit painful, but making a book about Jamie's artwork is absolutely a joy. And I'm very glad that you were on board with us doing this theme of being unsettled. It's the eerie, the haunting, the unnerving, the distressing, the anxious, you know, a lot of today's topics that come up in your paintings. And so I put together some slides just to help us through our discussion, give us some prompts, but we'll have time for your questions at the end too. Sometimes I know certain pictures have good stories behind them, so I'm hoping to share them with you all. So I want to introduce you, of course, to the book and to the exhibition that accompanies it, and it will be in Pennsylvania, in Maine, in South Carolina, in Ohio, and Seattle, Washington. So hopefully if you have friends all over the country, you can take them. One of the things that drew me to this topic was reading a small passage that you wrote, an introduction for another exhibition catalog, about art colonies and the coasts. And you called it The Ghost of Rockwell, Kent, and Me. And so right away I thought, there's an artist that works with ghosts. And you've talked about ghosts and how, I mean, we're not talking about spooky things that live in the attic unless we are talking about spooky things that live in the attic. I mean, these are the memories, the thoughts, the people you've known, but you never knew Rockwell Kent, right?
I didn't. After my first exhibition here in New York, I had money in my pocket, so I went to, it was a wonderful bookstore, it used to be in Lexington Avenue, called Vitie's. And I walked in and I was snooping around, and there was a drawing that looked like it was one of Kent's drawings from Moby Dick. So I went to Mrs. Vitie, and she said, yes, they had an exhibition when the book was published in 1929, of course, during the crash. So I said, well, do you have more? And she took me up to the attic, and there were all the chapter headings. So I bought them all with the proceeds of my show. My love of Rockwell Kent began with that.
Yeah, and Rockwell Kent is an artist that has had a rocky history in American art because
he's totally forgotten today. His main thing was that he got involved in politically as anybody with a brain at the point in the 50s. And of course the McCarthy hearings, and he was charged with being a communist, which he wasn't, but as a consequence, all his work was removed from American museums, and still to this day.
And where can you find it now? I'm sure you've seen it, some of it, I mean.
Well, the largest part of his work done on Mohegan Island, where I live in his house, is in the Soviet in Russia now, in the Pushkin and various things. And for years, he was the only American painter hung in from the Soviet Union. So I've just always, we've had a sort of mixed life, although we never knew one another. We corresponded a bit. But,
Yeah, and you went on to live in a house that he built, and so that's filled with spirits in other ways as well. So just to keep things interesting, I have an old picture and a new picture up here. One of the key things I find very unnerving about some of your paintings is when you paint a figure and don't reveal the face to us. And Sig Harvey photographed you exactly that way.
Yes.
So that is, I thought, well, if another artist has noticed this as well. So this is, Record Player is the earliest piece in the exhibition from 1964. So can you take us back to when this particular work, from 1964, where were you working? What were you doing? What would lead to a painting with no face?
It was this wonderful person, Lester Stanley, who I met, who was severely mentally impaired, and he looked like a sort of monk with his haircut and so forth. So at that point, I shared a studio with my father, and the Victrola, the record player, was in my part of the studio, and my father would play or have the recording of Sibelius and Rachmaninoff at high volume. I love music, but I can't work with music, so I have wax in my ears. And he taught Lester how to control the Victrola. So Lester would sit in this wonderful position working the dials. So I felt I had to record it.
So
and
that,
actually my first show in New York, that was in the window of Nerdler's, looking into the gallery.
well, that makes sense. That would draw people in. Now, to me, I mean, and there are a few paintings in your career's worth of work where this happens. I think it lets a lot to the viewer's imagination. I think that this whole exhibition of these works in particular can be as scary as you want them to be as a viewer. You've left a lot of open storylines in a certain way. Let's look at another, as scary as you want it to be, kind of image, these sheep drawings were some of the first things that I saw that I thought, these are kind of, I mean, they're animal portraits, but they're kind of haunting as well. You have a long history of working with animals. Is this sheep a particular friend of yours?
Well, it was the island next to Mohegan. And the problem I always felt with realism in painting is it tends to be sort of trite and cute, and particularly with animals. And there's a threatening side to animals. And this particular sheep I got to know pretty well. A hermit had raised on this island. So I did a whole series of these paintings. That one on the right is actually a letter I wrote to Lincoln Kirstein, who was the sort of mentor for me, and describing to him what I was working on and so forth.
And for those that can't see it, it says his face was unearthly pale. No, it was the blackest of blacks, and eyes unearthly pale. He terrifies me. So that was one of my main questions. Who are you telling about terrifying sheep? So Lincoln Kirstein is an important figure in your early development in the 1960s.
He's very important. Yeah. He'd been a big supporter of my father's work. In fact, was instrumental in the purchase of Christina's World for the Museum of Art. And then he became very interested in my work, and when I was very young, and then he wrote actually a poem about me saying what a terrifying child I was, not a nice child. But that sort of fascinated him, and so he, I mean, for my whole life, he was a huge influence on me. And in New York, when I first came to New York, was to do his portrait, and I wanted to study anatomy, so through some surgeons I knew, they got me into Columbia. That mortified Kirstein when I was doing these sort of studies, but I think he finally realized why.
And that's another portrait. I don't have an image of it, but Kirstein's portrait, he's half turned away from you. He's, you know, with glance over the shoulder, but really his back is to the viewer.
Which is a true portrait of Christine, if you know anything about him, when he started in New York City ballet and so forth. But he didn't like people, and if people approached him, he'd walk away. And so it was not something I cooked up. It was sort of that was his visage.
His
An
natural
amazing
state.
figure. I mean, something. You know, I mean, there've been a number of books about him, but he really is a giant in American culture.
Yeah.
Not only New York City ballet, but films and just.
And I always bring up Monuments Men. People do not know that he was one of the Monuments Men. Recruited with his great cultural knowledge to go abroad and help to identify and save works of cultural patrimony from the war. So, I mean, you got kind of a wonderful group of intellectual and artistic models, role models here. Now, since we were looking at Lady, I wanted to mention that, you know, there were several images of Lady, and this is even another study of Lady, and animals do play this huge role in your work. I mean, one of the favorite paintings at the Brandywine is your portrait of Pig, which is your pig Den Den. But there is the other end of things with the painting, the study here, the little watercolor called Deer Head too. And I was thinking, I don't remember very many not alive animals. You're usually capturing a spirit of them. You know, it might not be the cutest, sweetest aspect. But can you take us to this particular? This is so haunting.
It is, and you know, I remember working on it. I spent a lot of time walking the railroad tracks. I left school when I was in the 6th grade to be tutored, which my father had done due to illness. I just wanted to get the hell out of school and paint. And so I spent most of my days wandering the railroad tracks, went right through Judge Ford. And I came upon this chopped off head, and I think, and not only did I paint it once, I painted it twice, which is so strange.
Thank you very much, though, because that means we can have it in many exhibitions.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But it's, and I didn't consciously looking at make it for the horror of it,
Yeah.
but I loved, you know, I'd grown up with deer, there are a lot of deer around Chatsworth, and then to see it just decapitated was sort of a shock to me. So I think, and again, it's trying to get edge into realism and
Yeah.
not just a cute Bambi sort of thing.
Oh yeah, no, this is no Bambi, that's
Yeah.
for sure. Well, you mentioned when we were talking about this during the opening that it was along the train tracks, and I wondered if this was a train accident as well. And
I
you know,
think it was just hunters.
yeah, hunters and poachers and that sort of thing. Exactly. But those train tracks around Chad's Ford have a gruesome history in and of themselves, and it has touched and affected your family as well with your grandfather's death, N.C. Wyeth's death, at those train tracks in Chad's Ford. And sort of to turn things to a family state of mind, I brought one of your newest works here, your Screen Door Apples. And I think people look at this in the book, and they don't quite understand how it's happening. When they see it in the gallery, oh, it's a real door. It's a real door. So this screen door sequence is something that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years. How did the transformation to the 3 dimensions?
You know, I don't know. I've always been fascinated by doors and people behind them.
Yeah.
And the screen. The first one I did really was a Warhol.
Yeah, I'll have that in a sec,
screen
yeah.
door. And so it just intrigued the hell out of me. And then, but to attempt one of my grandfather, I never knew my grandfather. But as a child, he was, I mean, he had more influence on me than my own father, I think, in my work. We lived in my father's studio, which was down the lower part of the hill, and the upper part was the big N.C. Wyeth studio, which of course, he had died a couple years before I was born, and I would spend hours poring through, all his illustrations were still there. Scribner's, after they were published, they'd send back the originals, and he had just, so I would spend hours, you know, going through Robin Hood, King Arthur, and so forth. And then I'd, you know, walk down the hill to our house, and there was my father, you know, painting a dead crow. Well, it had no interest in me whatsoever. Here I've been in all this excitement of, but again, I think that's the contrast with the creative mind. I gave my grandfather's studio to Brandywine when it was left to me, and so thinking I never could work there. And young people go in and they see this vast studio with all these costumes and the swords and the guns and all the illustrations. And then you go to the Andrew Wyeth studio, and there's nothing there. It's just four walls. So I think it's fascinating for young people to see that both produce.
Yeah. There's no one path to being an artist for sure, and no one path even in the same family.
Yeah.
It's interesting the way you described it. It's sort of like you didn't know your grandfather. It was like the only Wyeth you didn't know. But you knew his archive. You knew, probably if he was alive, you wouldn't have been able to paw through all of his things and his drawings. That would be his working space.
Yeah, and I think he was a difficult man. He
Yeah.
had great reservations
Do you have another
about
picture?
his own work. And the whole theme of the painting of he, well, there he is with
There
that
he
one.
is.
But that came to me to be more of a metaphor. His sort of, I mean, he had these remarkable children, and the one daughter had a concert at the Philadelphia Orchestra when she was 15. My father had his first show when he was 17. So there was it was exhilarating, I think, to N.C. Wyeth, but also depressing. And so he went through terrible depressions from what I've asked my father. So that, the painting, again, is not just an old man with cute apples.
No, I would not accuse you of painting cute things ever. You know, even the dogs are a little like, that has, you know, some edge to it. But that was actually one of the points I was going to get to in having the studio and your grandfather's archive. The Brandywine now has the letters of N.C. Wyeth that your mother arranged and saved and cataloged. And going through the family photos, I think this man never smiled at all. I mean, he is just, he's so stern, and maybe leads to part of that metaphor as well. This,
And really, as a father, I mean, my father described, you know, he'd come down from the studio, having gone up there at dawn, to lay in a painting for Treasure Island or something, and then come down and talk about the smoke in the studio, and cook a huge breakfast for his 6 kids, you know, and I mean, at Christmas, he'd get up on the roof and as if he were old Chris and ringing bells. I mean, he was magical.
That's true. There are archival film footage of your grandfather and the kids when they're young. He's playing right along with them as Robin Hood and you know, King Arthur and all of these things. So he's also a kid at heart.
And that is why I think he still resonates. I mean, Scribner, there's still the Bookstore, still published and so forth. I remember I came to New York for the New York Public Library has all the Robin Hoods, the originals, and I think kidnapped, I guess. And they finally realized these were more valuable and they shouldn't just be in a children's thing. And so I came up for the opening and they had them restored. And I was standing there, and this woman, must have been in her 90s, wheeled up to me and clutched my hand and said, "Oh, Mr. Wyeth, I'm so thrilled to meet you." And I said, "Well, thank you." And she said, "I grew up in your illustrations of David Duff." So she must have felt the fountain of youth was enchanted for her. But I thanked her very much, and she seemed very happy.
It's fantastic. Well, talk about your earlier days in New York. You know, I wanted to talk about, we looked at one screen door. Here's that first screen door in the series, in the sequence of Warhol. And, you know, though I've heard you talk about, you know, working in the factory and, you know, doing these portraits of Warhol, I guess I don't really know how you met Warhol. How did you cross paths with him?
It was through a mutual friend, Peter Beard, a photographer.
Right.
And he took me down there one time. And of course, I'd been fascinated by Warhol's work, but mainly by his visage. And he lived up to everything, I imagine. And what attracted me most about him was his childlike quality. He had a real sort of sense of wonder. And I see now, you know, the copyists, the people, the sort of Warhols and whatnot, they all are very kind of cute and edgy with their things. Well, Warhol's work, there's a sense of, if there's one Monroe, let's do 40. Or if there's, you know, I mean, it was this wonderful sense of wonderment is what appealed to me.
It seemed so such a contrast to the Chad's Ford, where you said you grew up, whether it was the illustrator's studio or your father alone in the studio with a crow, to go to New York to the factory. I mean, that is a completely different kind of studio, and you worked there, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
it created part of the factory for me to work in, and you gotta remember, he was the first serious painter that I knew other than my father. And, you know, I'd met legions of Andrew Wyeth copies and whatnot, and then to meet, it was fascinating.
Yeah.
And it was a whole different milieu, but it was backed up by this wonderful sense of wonder. That, which I think is why his work still resonates so much today.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, both of these are included in our exhibition, partly because of the unsettling quality that visage, his fright wig, his presence, and the way, especially in something like Consommé, it feels ethereal the way you've painted him. It feels otherworldly. In working at the factory, was there ever any, you know, crosstalk while he's working and you're working, and this is while wild things are going on at the factory as well, or were you just sort of
Well,
hidden away?
yes, things, no, I mean, people would come in costume and they get for hours in school at the times we wander in and out. And it always fascinating because he was sort of the fly paper to it. But his reaction would always be, oh, really? And I mean, that just intrigued me. I mean, he would come to Chad's Ford and spend time on my farm, and people come to me and say, I had the most interesting conversation with your friend Warhol. And I knew Andy's side of the conversation was, oh, really? And they would pour their lives out.
He was probably tape recording it
He
as well.
was.
Well, and there are many recordings that in the Warhol archive
That still haven't been listened to.
Yeah.
So many.
yes, absolutely. I know.
Aren't there thousands of them, Vincent?
I think you're.
There's an embargo. You can't hear them.
Wow.
You can go to the museum and sit and listen to it.
Right.
But you can't take any notes.
Oh, is that right? Interesting.
Which I'm not gonna go into.
Right.
We're going to work on that.
Yes.
Well, so while we're talking about the 60s, I thought, you know, it can't all be your paintings. Oh, the two of you there. You painted each other's portrait. We've talked about that before. But I think your approach to painting portraits is so different than what Warhol's, you know, approach to his portraits were, using Polaroids and screen printing. You're using a very Renaissance-based technique at this point.
And he was fascinated by it. I mean, he'd watch me as I do, and he'd say, "You're using too much pimple paint. Get rid of the pimple paint." And of course, and at one point he told me one of his favorite toys as a child were paper dolls. Well, you look at his portraits; they're all paper dolls. They're all these cut out eyes.
Very flat, yeah.
So there's a real
And
genius.
your method, you know, with using the calipers and measurements after measurements to get everything so accurate.
That really was sort of a method that I used. It wasn't that I needed the actual inches and fractions. It just got me more familiar with, I mean, when I did Rudolf Nureyev, the Russian painter, you know, I was just fascinated by this man. It's all illusion ballet. He'd fly through the air. Well, he was teeny. And you know, and so I just was fascinated to measure. He said, "You make measure so much you could make me suit."
Well, and when I go back, because some of those notebooks are in the Brandywine's collection, and read, there is no measurement that says 7.15 inches or 8 3/8 inches. They're all a measurement of a unit that's defined the space between the eyes, you know, 2.5 times the space between the eyes. So it's a code in and of itself that you're using. Here's where I was going. Young, you. This is, I mean, you look like you might be a politician in the making here. You're, and you are hanging out with the Kennedys a little bit at this point, you know.
But that
doing
was work too.
Yeah, that's all work. That's all work. It's work.
Yeah.
No, I found this in Down East magazine, or the article was called "An Artist Named Jamie." You know, it was sort of, you know, introducing Jamie Wyeth, and you know, wearing suits, and it's very different from what a young starting out artist might be
Well,
doing and working on today.
It probably was an opening, and I was in costume. You know,
You're doing that.
make believe.
So, you know, back then, your style of working is it's tighter, it's less expressionistic than what we see now, like what we've seen in the screen doors. And I have two examples here. I think both of these are watercolors.
Well, actually, the one on the left is an oil
An
on
oil.
board, and yes, the one on the right is a watercolor. But, you know, these are obsessions of mine, and I think that, you know, there's this threatening element in an axe, no
Yeah,
question,
sure.
and a tree that looks like a torso left or something. But again, that's what gets me excited. It gets me deeper into it rather than just, I mean, trees don't interest me really. But if I have a tree that I've known for years, and I can lift it into something more than just a pretty tree.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what I was thinking about, the way that you're able to animate something mundane, something run-of-the-mill, an inanimate object like an axe or a tree. And in fact, I know you're not totally obsessed with trees, but this is a really great tree as well. And this is a tree that has, I don't want to say haunted you, but it's lived in your memory for a long time, this particular
Yeah,
tree.
it was near my farm, and I thought it was gonna go into the river. It was just hung on by its roots, and I became so intrigued, so I went there at dawn till dusk, every night for a month working on this thing. And finally did a smaller version of this, and of course the tree still existed for another 40 years. And so finally, the 40th anniversary, I went back and did it in life size. And the person who owned the land, the tree, died the day I finished it, and the tree fell over. Well, it was so extraordinary.
You've got supernatural
Yeah,
trees.
I mean,
I
it was just bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, we see this living spirit in many of your inanimate objects, right? You know, it feels like it's alive, it's moving, and you know, I delve in the essay a little bit into that concept in popular culture that comes up all the time in horror movies or books, or you know, whether it's you know, innocuous children's material where a tree is talking and alive, or something more threatening like Poltergeist has a scene in it like that. But this is also monumentally scaled, this one. It went from a small original version that's tightly rendered, and I think this new version is much more, you know, obviously represents your work these days.
8 feet long.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it's really large, it's really expressive. The colors have veered away from tightly, realistically, you know, visually accurate. So in the same subject matter, you can find all these approaches as well. I wanted to ask you about portraits of other things. So portraits of axes, portraits of trees. But portraits of houses is something, as I was looking through your body of work, there are some that stand out that I have to say look very much like faces to me. And I'm wondering if you saw them and recognized faces in them, recognized as an innate spirit in them, or if that's something that is imagined and created as you're painting the work. So Squirrel Island, you know, looks like a jack-o'-lantern,
Yes,
I
yeah.
see. And I imagine if you saw that would have intrigued you at the time.
Well, it's not so much that I saw human elements in it, but there's something about, and the island most of these were done on, other than Squirrel, is Mohegan Island. And Mohegan has unique sort of architecture. And I found I was more fascinated at one point with the houses the islanders lived in than the islanders. It became more a portrait of them than really than just doing shingles and a chimney and so forth. So it was an obsession. I mean, I have these crazy obsessions, and that's why I find an exhibition very painful, because I feel like a jackass walking through it, you know. It's like writer friends of mine, I say it was like everybody reading your book, you know, and you were standing there. And so, but there they are. And I can see, but I think you're right, certainly I've gotten more color and so forth, but it's been an unconscious movement. I find if I start sort of theorizing, you know, I freeze, and most of my work is really done from dreams. I mean, I have learned to keep a pad on my bed, and morning after morning I wake up and the pad's all scattered around drawings, and most of these are hieroglyphics. But out of it, occasionally, I mean, the series I did on seagulls, the 7 Deadly Sins, that I found all these things of, you know, then I saw, oh my God, it's a bird. And then I saw I'd written sin. So, I mean, I bring this up because most of my painting is done not in front of an easel, with brushes in my hand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another piece of architecture that you know very well is on Southern Island. This,
Yes,
you know, the house, the lighthouse, the bell tower, and two views of the same place here with distinctly different characteristics. So now, I'm imagining the one on the left is that kind of dreamlike quality to it, but I know that you have experience seeing the view of Berg from the water. Most of us would be terrified at the thought of being in that water.
Well, you wouldn't last very long.
Yeah.
And shortly after I moved to this island, I would take a boat, a power boat, coming back and forth to the island. And one day in February, it was absolutely below zero. I was zooming along, and I gave what I thought was enough room by this iceberg. And sort of like the Titanic, it was 3 times the size of the movie. So that I hit it, and I went flying off and ended up on top of the ice. So he came to and realized I'm rowing back and forth from now on. I mean, you know, it's threatening to see. And if you live on it, you learn to really respect it. I mean, it's pretty scary.
And living on an island forces you, of course. Most of us landlocked people, you know, don't have to deal with the sea all the time, and you're literally surrounded by this thing that seems sometimes trying to consume you all the time.
Well, which I adore, and I find, you know, in the day and the age we live in, there's so many wonderful things in theater, I want to see in films and so on. I'd never paint. And so I realized that I had to remove myself physically, and an island does do that. You know, you can't just get into a car and drive off. And then you have the whole microcosm of the island, and as the times that go by, it's very thrilling. People come to the island occasionally if I let them on the island, and they'll say, well, you must be running out of things to paint. And I mean, I could live 5 lifetimes there and still barely scratch the surface.
And I think that's the another kind of very common pop culture fear of being isolated, of you know, of course my mind goes to Stephen King or something like that, to misery, to being trapped versus wanting to be there. And it's that isolation, loneliness, separation from the rest of society is something that would not, a lot of people would not do well with that, couldn't focus, would go stir crazy. Okay, another movie, The Shining. I mean, out there, you're sort of out isolated, so isolated, and you prefer that to keep being able to work. Yeah.
I actually worked with King on a project, and his first thing was, you are a very strange man. And he bought a big painting of mine, which was a dream thing of my father and my grandfather, and gave it to his wife for her birthday, Tabitha's birthday.
Yeah. So island people are something I would like to talk about a little bit more, but I think my next slide is, well, you'll tell me if it's an island people or not. This is down at the farm.
This is actually the farm.
Yeah. So I only know that because I think the hat says Point Lookout on the head. So this is a painting that I think gives more and more the more you look at it. It's very constructed, and it has elements of humans interacting with animals and that sort of thing. But can you talk about the genesis of this? Because I think it's probably someone you know, yes?
Well, it is somebody I know who actually is terrified of animals. And so
what a wonderful way to paint him.
That became even more perfect, you know, that I mean, he is a hunter, and he did chop the heads off and put them up there, but so that made it all more interesting.
Oh yeah, so for those that, I have a detail here, for those that can't see, some of the details in the painting that, you know, once you get past it's a man he looks a little like a supervillain in a black coat. But this, is it a falcon? Do you have falcons?
I don't have falcons, but what I did raise, which he helped me with, is a vulture. And as Phyllis, my wife, said, only a mother could love a vulture. And she wouldn't let the vulture in the house, but
Culture the vulture, right?
vulture the vulture. I
Culture
got
the
a whole
vulture.
series of paintings of him.
Yeah, I miss those. Yeah, and the skulls, not just the antlers, the trophies that a hunter, but the whole skull with the gaping eyes. So, I mean, whether it's, I always think, and let me go back one, if I found myself in this scenario, this is wholly terrifying. I don't look like, it seems like I am being caught, being someplace I don't belong. And the other detail over there are the guns on the wall. This is one with the innocuous title of Bean Boots. And so it's the least scary thing is what
Yes, exactly.
this is what it's named for. Now you saw I skipped over there just a second ago. One of those birds, one of those gulls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the one in the exhibition. But you mentioned the 7 deadly sins. You mentioned, I mean, you did a series of carny gulls. The animal nature, especially of the seagull, has been fascinating to you too.
Well, most gulls appear in paintings as doves. And in fact, they're terrifying creatures. They eat one another, they're scavengers, which I love about them.
And that's, I mean, I feel like we're all on board with you because it's the one kind of bird that we were taught from very early on to be terrified of by Alfred Hitchcock, right?
Yes.
He opened that door for us to say the animal world is mysterious and we will never understand it. And you keep the mystery alive.
Well,
I think.
oddly enough, a friend of mine worked on that film, and the only reason they used seagulls is that they were trainable.
Yeah.
It's the only reason. Crows and seagulls.
Yeah, there's other little birds in the film that go nuts, you know, the lovebirds and things like that. But this is something that when I'm touring people through the exhibition and they have maybe no background about art or the Wyeth family or that sort of thing, this is something that everyone can relate to because it is so close. I mean, it's so close. It is just about to get you, and it's that tense moment of becoming a victim, right in that moment. And I think once I got the film still of Tippi Hedren there, I realized how not scary Alfred Hitchcock's birds were, and yours just becomes more terrifying.
I actually did this. The fishermen and the Mohegan would take me out, and we'd spend all day going back and forth dropping, and the gulls would get right in the stern of the boat and fly, and I'd be kneeling at the stern. So they were as if they were coming right at you.
Posing
They're pretty incredible.
for you, yeah. Well, I mentioned living on an island and your enjoyment of an island and what you get out of it, but there are kind of a lot of island people in your work as well. I feel like you observing, whether it's the farmers around Chatsford, but the people of Monhegan and the islands in Mid-Coast Maine. And one great example is Kyle Murdoch here. And people have asked me repeatedly, is this for real? Did this kid really have a dead cat museum?
What he created was he had an aunt who had loved cats and so forth, and the cats would die, and she'd throw them under her house.
Someone told me there were dead cats under the porch, and I was like, oh God, not Jamie's
Crawled
porch.
under at age 8 years old, and they're all in various forms, frozen. And he created this museum. And then you could hire him to come to your house, and he'd bring 3 in a suitcase. And he'd open the suitcase. And he wouldn't allow any cameras because he said you'd never come back to see them again. You just look at photographs of them. I mean, he was very
Sort of like the Warhol archive.
Yes.
But the idea of a person that keeps their dead cats under the porch, and B, the person that says, hey, this is a money-making scheme. I mean, there are definitely some character studies, character studies that you found as inspiration on these islands. And of course, you become one of the characters yourself as the unusual artist on the hill. I think we've waited long enough to mention you're from a family of artists, a huge family of artists. And I gathered together here your grandfather, NC, Father Andrew, your aunts, Henriette and Carolyn Wyeth, all standing in front of wonderful paintings at their easels. But I wanted to talk to you about one family member who didn't paint, and your mother. Not a painter, but we're learning so much more about her creativity, her preservation, her desires, not just her management of art careers, but of being an author, being a creator, being a preservationist unto herself. And I think I've been looking and thinking about, have you painted a portrait of your mother?
Yeah, I've done
Yes.
several.
Yeah,
Over
good.
the years, not a portrait per se, but her going in and out of a house.
Well, and this is what I came up with, right?
Yeah.
My mother in the
Yes,
squall.
there she is,
And
exactly.
is she up there?
That's she at the top.
At the top.
Yes.
So she's very far. And there's another one of these called something like My Mother Had the
In the
Gull.
sea serpent.
Yeah, something like that. You're throwing dangerous things at her.
No, she's an amazing, she was a
Yeah.
remarkable person. And,
Yeah.
and of course, the other thing, she titled all my father's
That's
work.
right.
And I did it lifted, Christine was world, you get any better than that, or Wind from the Sea, and just lifted them into something. And she was his really severest critic. So I always say, really, her signature should be almost next to his.
It's true. Well, we are thinking of them in future projects as collaborators
Yeah.
in many ways. And so, maybe that collaboration and that support that your father got from your mother maybe leads us to talk just a little bit about Phyllis.
Uh-huh.
I don't think she ever titled your paintings,
No.
but I get the sense she was an advisor, or at least someone who
Well,
who would,
certainly.
yes.
When she died, the Brandywine game, he said, well, let's put an exhibition together of things you've done, but I said, I only did a very few. My God, there were like 78.
You did a lot. You did a lot.
So it was sort of unconscious, and she was a terrible model, but maybe that made me attracted to her. She
So this
certainly
is-
appears a lot.
This is the two of you at the opening of the
Of the
Brandywine
Brandywine.
Museum, when they first opened,
Yeah.
and then a great moment when Union Rags won the Belmont in 2012, and both of you there. But the book that you all have does have one portrait of Phyllis in it, right? But this is no straightforward sit in a chair and look lovely. And this has got a lot of other things going on. So can you walk us through this a little bit? I hope she's
This
not being
was-
attacked by trees
And
here.
no, it was the thing that she would do at the farm every spring. She would get whoever was working the farm to help her hang tree rocks. And when I first saw it, I thought, what in the hell are you doing? And she was weighting the branches down so the tree would spread. But it had the surreal look to it.
Yeah.
And so I did drawings of the rocks and the tree. And finally, towards the end, I said, I've got to really do the process where all the various people appeared in the tree and her directing which rock to hang where. It was a wonderful kind of thing of spring.
Yeah, it's very filled with spring. Yeah.
But
And-
a little peculiar too.
A little bit, it does go out and over the edges of the canvas.
Well, I was sort of bored. I got a frame for it, and I kept thinking about it at night. It wasn't working, so one night I got up at 2 in the morning, went to my studio, got my palette and the colors, and painted the frame. Of course, Phyllis came down in the morning and said, "Oh my God, you're gonna paint the whole room."
She said, "Are you
spread
mad?"
The table, and I often thought I really should have. It was
Yeah.
really great.
Well, you have time. You can do that.
Yeah.
So that was the last picture I wanted to show you, but that discussion of Phyllis really reminds me of the new documentary film that's out, that is about to be released about you, because Phyllis plays such a large role in the film as well. So I wanted to let everyone here know of this new documentary. It's premiering this weekend here in New York at the Quad, and you'll be doing another program with that on Saturday. It is a full-length documentary. It does cover your whole life. Some of the things we've talked about here tonight, but also many other subjects. And it moves and is three-dimensional, and it has a beautiful cinematography. And so I wanted you all to be aware of that. If you have the notion to go, we hope it'll be on available to everyone to see in streaming services later this year and everything like
But
that.
they did a remarkable job, and the thing is that they had a year shoot, ended up being 6 years because of COVID. So you'll see the credit list goes on for an hour at the end of the film.
There are quite a lot of
It's
it.
really remarkable photography. I mean, the aerial things of the islands.
Of the
and
islands,
seagulls.
yes.
Yeah.
Right in with you, and You standing back to us here. I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with these rookie figures at this point. I think everybody sees you as a mysterious figure out on an island there, and can't help but take that photograph. But I wanted to thank you for joining us, and I think we have time to take some questions from any of you if you have some secret insider information you'd like to pry out of our guest.
Quite enough.
You can make things up.
Quite enough. Thank you for urging me to get here and whatnot.
You have one? Yes.
Do you work primarily in oils and watercolor?
I'm an odd technician. I combine them all. I do watercolor as oil. I mean, I'm probably a terrible technician. I've been known to stick things in ovens to dry them out, so they dry faster.
Mixed
And then
honey with things.
Well, then I went through a period where I didn't want them to dry, and I got oil with clove. Those paintings still were wet. Collections and whatnot. So I'm the last person to
Yeah, the conservators who deal with your work are always very intrigued.
Yeah, and the work, I mean, when I did the stuff on the Rev, the dancer, I wanted to start with a small thing, and then, I got to know, and then I would take cardboard where all the scenery was put in the bed and so forth, and do them on cardboard, which to me wasn't conscious, but then I realized it was sort of wonderful. Here was the Prince of Dance, and I was doing it on shit paper.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, here was this elegant sort of thing. It made it.
I mean, and also, in your area of works, I always think about Toulouse-Lautrec and his dancers he was painting, but into a popular form, into the poster form. It's like the cardboard of the day, right?
Yes, yeah.
But that didn't make them any less gorgeous, elegant, important. But I also see like that popular media, the Brillo box of Warhol,
And Momo owns one of the ones I did in the Rev and cardboard, and they say they stopped the cardboard from eating itself.
Yeah, you can do the magical conservators.
Right.
Sorry, right here, and then we'll go up to you.
Hi, I was just curious about the knickers. Can you explain?
Everybody thinks this vegan. My grandfather wore knickers. I live on an island, and I got tired of chopping my pants off because I'm always wearing boots. So I just chopped all my pants off, and now I have them made. So they're this simple as that. It's not sort of an NCY touch, but it is maybe a little bit.
It's practical.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you did mention Arnold Schwarzenegger portrait.
Oh my
Is
gosh.
what, Jamie, I worked with Andy Warhol for many years, and Jamie was the artist in residence, but we actually smelled oil paint for a while, because Andy painted with acrylics. But you remember the side of the Andy studio you were on was Fred Hughes' office.
Fred Hughes' office.
And you got those big screens you put, which you gave Fred afterwards, but it was Arnold Schwarzenegger with his shirt off and doing his, muscle butting. That portrait was, session was fantastic. And if you were walking down Broadway and 17th Street, you look up, and there was Jamie painting Arnold Schwarzenegger. People stopped and looked in the window. But there's another story attached to that too. A certain Patasa.
Patasa, yes,
Yeah.
incredible. There was, I don't know if I can tell this.
I know I can't show the pictures of
You
that
did it when
story.
we did an interview a lot, on Zoom. You did.
Yes.
It's out in the world.
This was at the end of the day, and we were sort of finishing up, and Schwarzenegger was pulling on his clothes, and Andy came into him with Victor Hugo, and I thought, oh, here's trouble. And Andy said, oh, I saw this really beautiful person, Arnold would really love her and whatnot, she's so pretty. And so in came this very tall woman in a silk taffeta ball gown. This is 4:30 in the afternoon at Union Square. And so she sat down in front, and Andy was, oh, this is how you start taking photographs. And so I sat down on her knees and started doing a drawing of her. She was amazing looking. And Schwarzenegger, who barely spoke English, was starting to put the move on, this sort of thing. All this was going on And Victor said something to her, with that she lifted her dress, and here's an erect penis about him standing. And I backed up, and of course Schwarzenegger was
And there was in fact a photographer there that captured this.
and recently sat for contacted me
Yeah.
and said, who are you with, or what's happened to
So we
you?
could put the photograph.
Is she still alive?
No, that's a good question.
Wasn't she a model for Salvador Dali,
Yeah.
is what I heard.
Wow.
And really quite stunning.
And Andy liked the setup. It was,
He probably took the photo.
He did.
Yeah.
because Arnold was walking around the studio, hitting on any woman that walked in, basically. But he was very charming. He was just becoming well-known and famous. So
He would, for this to happen, you were absolutely right. You thought this was an attractive, we were all waiting for that moment.
Other shoe to drop. So to speak.
I actually told that story at his wedding, and I asked for it, and he was not pleased.
Oh, okay, wonderful. On that note,
Yes. I think
walking
that
down
is-
memory lane in New York with Jamie.
That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I think we're doing some signings